Yeah, the deep test. Again, welcome everyone to the European Studies Center. It's a great pleasure to have full house for this panel. My name is Dimitar Bechev, and I'm the director of the DAHRENDORF program, where we have a project on Europe in a changing world for the next 2.5 years, I suppose. As part of it, we're looking at relations between Europe, that is the EU, plus the UK, of course. The UK still qualifies as Europe in our minds, with 5 critical players globally: Russia, Turkey, United States, China, and India. But obviously, we're looking at global politics more broadly, all there. I'm delighted today to be chairing this panel discussion where we explore Europe's relations with 3 of those critical players. We call them middle powers, and of course we'll be probably unpacking this term going forward: India, Brazil, and Turkey. I couldn't think of any better moment to have this discussion. I'm sure you guys, or many of you, as me, spent the last couple of days, as they say these days, that doom scrolling, looking at the outputs from the Munich Security Conference, or as the economists call it, the Munich Insecurity Conference, with all manner of US government officials and dignitaries making fights with their European counterparts, but also signaling that we live in a very different world. The transatlantic divide is into the open right now. We can agree on as much, which probably is a good way to draw your attention to something on the screen there. It's a very interesting publication that Timothy Gartner, who is with us here, he's the chair of the board of the DAHRENDORF program and the founding father, or founding parent number 1, as J.D. Vance probably won't say these days. And Mark Leonard, CFR and Ivan Krasnev published its annual survey of global attitudes to pretty much everything under the sun, but in particular power politics, the US, and international relations more broadly. And this is what we see in terms of another rift, how the world at large has been reacting at the election of Donald Trump. We have India, which is very upbeat about the world that is on the horizon with the Trump phenomenon in full swing. And then we have countries like China, like Brazil, but also Turkey, that are on the fence. And all those countries, they have their own particular reasons to be having this attitude. But what's important to underscore, as the paper does, and if you could move the next slide. So this is the paper you're welcome to read. There's a divide between Europe and the rest of the world when it comes to their perception of the US, but also global order. And that's something we'll be reflecting here at this panel. Also, today is the day that the US and Russia held first round of talks in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, of all places, which is symbolic on many levels, whatever you think about the outcome of the meetings, but it clearly signifies that the world has changed profoundly. And now for us as Europeans, including in this fine country, the question is how we react to this new world order that is shaping before our eyes. And there are all manner of responses. Some member states of the EU, but also the UK to an extent, their instinct is to hug America even more closely, try to build a connection to the Trump administration, play for the long term, believing that there will be a reset in the future. Others Here, Emmanuel Macron plays a prominent role, have been arguing for strategic autonomy, building capacity in defense, but also in state-of-the-art technologies and artificial intelligence. There was a summit in Paris before the Munich Security Forum. Interestingly enough, the UK and the US didn't sign the final communique, but China did. But Macron has been saying, let's be in the middle, something that those of you studying the Cold War probably remember from previous generations, this sort of mentality of Europe being a power in its own right. But that's easier said than done. Yesterday, we had another summit in Paris that didn't go according to those expectations amongst Europhiles that believe that it's the era of Europe arriving. But just all this to say that it's a complicated world out there. There are dilemmas for the Europeans, and there's a huge challenge how we adapt or not to what's coming on the horizon. And we're really fortunate to have this discussion with a number of speakers that are well qualified to discuss the perspectives of critical players in global politics. So I would invite speakers to address 3 points in the beginning and then maybe open for discussion. First one is not to be Eurocentric and self-referential, but look at the countries themselves, how India, Brazil, but also Turkey look at the world today and their position in the present world order and the coming world order as well. Second, maybe to reflect on how they think that Europe fits or doesn't fit into world order. And thirdly, time permitting, to reflect on the bilateral relationship. What sort of legacies, dynamics, historical hang-ups, if you will, play into it. And they have generous amount of time for that, 7 minutes each. I'm sure they'll do a stellar job. We'll start with India, and I'll present each speaker as they come, as they pass time. So we have first Kira Huju, who is a former student of Oxford, and she has a position now at the London School of Economics, but it won't be spilling the beans to say that she's leaving academia. She will be economist correspondent in chief in New Delhi, India. So she's changing trades, but makes her uniquely qualified to reflect on some of those issues. Over to you, Kira, if you give us some flavor about the Indian view of the world and Europe in particular.
Thank you. I suppose it's already a sign of things to come that I wrote a whole book on India and world order, and in my notes I do in no way reflect the first point that you just suggested that we should touching on it. I go sort of very hard just on the bilateral. I think all the time that Tim has invited me to talk, I've spoken about world order and European misperceptions, and somehow I've now shifted to the third one, but very happy to answer questions on the other points. I'm going to start with a sentence that I never thought that I would say, which is that India is the talk of the town in Brussels. Not a moment too soon. The India-EU strategic partnership was based on a 2020 to 2022 political roadmap that is obviously now coming to an end. So the EU will be thinking, hopefully long and hard, about how to take that conversation forward. Now, the new Commission is sending two kinds of signals on India. The first one is eagerness to deepen ties. Ursula von der Leyen announced in January that the first trip of her new term would be to India. She's bringing the full College of Commissioners with her. Now, the visit itself is only happening later this month, so I can't give you any interesting gossip on it. But if you want a fun piece playing off of this trip, or what the EU could learn from India, so switching around the way that we usually think about these things, we have quite a funny Charlemagne column on this in the current issue of The Economist. I have already started talking in the we when I talk about The Economist. But The Economist, I still tell them I'm academic. So the second signal is an implicit, sometimes quite sheepish acknowledgement, which is that the EU has been underperforming, really really significantly when it comes to India. We have a telling phrase by our new High Rep for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Galip, who told the European Parliament that the EU's relations with India have so much unexplored potential. Now, trade talks with India are famously exhausting to anyone who engages with them, but we really haven't seen much progress on an India-EU FTA. They're always pegged to a new Diwali that's upcoming, so, any Diwali now, but it has been a while. The EU as an entity was very, very slow on the uptick to start talking about the geopolitical construct of the Indo-Pacific, which is how India is now trying, if we want to talk about world order, trying to conceive of its place in the world. It's had a really tough time trying to become a regional hegemon, partly because of Pakistan, partly because it's just not a very benign hegemon in the neighborhood, partly because it's now getting competition from China. So its attempt at trying to become a superpower is basically to transcend its neighborhood by thinking about the Indo-Pacific as the place in which it can find its more hegemonic position. Now, individual countries, especially France, have been much better at courting India. France, given its strong defense and security ties. Unfortunately, there isn't actually much that you can learn from France when it comes to dealing with India if you are the European Union. France's approach to building this relationship is built on defense partnerships and large weapons sales, while very eagerly disregarding questions on human rights and democratic backsliding and underperforming on trade. So in some ways, the inverse of what you might expect the EU to want to pursue in terms of how it presents itself. So there'll be some strategic thinking going on how to do this. I heard from Nicholas Armstrong, who's in charge of the Indo-Pacific for the European Action Service a couple of months ago, that the EU was readjusting its approach to a quote-unquote modern partnership. This is a somewhat euphemistic term that my former colleagues in the India department at the British Foreign Office also are delighted in overusing. What does modern partnership mean? It means a few things. Firstly, a very healthy realization that India is a rising power on its own rights, right? So it cannot be talked down to in the often somewhat condescending tone that Europeans have adopted with much of the post-colonial world. Secondly, a somewhat cowardly, if maybe accurate, realization that the EU cannot keep banking on the two being the two world's largest democracies, and thus inherently sharing a set of values and interests when it comes to how you might want to redefine an increasingly post-European world. We have very significant democratic backsliding in India, but also, unfortunately, as we all know, across many EU member states. So that's not necessarily the most healthy basis on which to build a modern 21st century partnership. So then what alternative foundations do you have for such a relationship? For better or for worse, while we're moving away from values, one of the most durable bases for partnership in international diplomacy is a common adversary. So let's go on a bit of a hunt for adversaries together. I know that this is not usually how the EU has wanted to talk about its place in the world. But of course, Europe's arch enemy won't do. Russia maintains and even continues to deepen its ties with a fairly opportunistic India, not least in the light of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We've talked about this at length in this room, so I won't go into it in depth, but Russia is out. It's very hard as Europeans to talk to India about Russia and not get them very, very upset. Then we have another emerging candidate, even if one that is usually unspoken, and that is China. I keep hearing from European strategic thinkers that the EU-India relationship will prove to be an effective hedge against China. I'd not be too confident on that being a solid basis for the relationship because a common adversary in this case does not a common strategy make. I think there's often a misunderstanding about how India views China and what it wants the European Union to do and what it wants the rest of the sort of Western world to do. India is very keen on what it used to call non-alignment, what Ivan apparently now calls geostrategic polyamory. And what now, under Modi, partly for very petty ideological reasons, we can't call non-alignment because that's an Nehruvian term. We have to call it multi-alignment, essentially a very similar thing. And so multi-alignment means India's diplomatic doctrine of engaging multiple partners but formally aligning with none. Which means that India will want maximal diplomatic freedom in deciding how to calibrate its relations with its mighty neighbor. Most recently, we've also seen an adaptation following the China-India border agreement from October, which has allowed India to pursue a more conciliatory defense strategy and also to resume many forms of Chinese investment, infrastructure and imports, which were on hold. And so India does not want to contain China in the way that the EU might. But of course, we also have the additional challenge that EU member states also do not see eye to eye on what it means to contain China. So China's out. We're stuck with a third option, strangely and very uncomfortably for any transatlanticist in the room. Another rather new potential joint adversary is the United States of America. At least as we have witnessed this country under Trump 1.0 and already under Trump 2.0, which seems to be an even more craven, turbocharged America First view of world order. So I won't rehearse what's already happened on Europe, NATO, Ukraine. But I will say that there is some philosophical convergence here between Europe and India when it comes to underlying ways of dealing with world order. In much the same way that India talks about its need to maximize its strategic autonomy, which is a term that always comes with multi-alignment. Strategic autonomy is, of course, also a word that has now for some time floated in the Brussels consciousness, in no small part thanks to Macron. We can no longer rely on American cooperation, American security guarantees, or funds, basic levels of diplomatic sanity. And so we must finally grow up in geostrategic and geoeconomic terms and become more geopolitically and diplomatically independent. This is much closer to Indian thinking, actually, than our old emphasis on Western alliances was. So you might sort of think that on some underlying philosophical level, maybe we're now at least using terms where there's some mutual recognition, just to bring Calypso into the room. The slight kink in this plan, as the slide that we had earlier points out, is that India has received the news of Trump's victory in a very different register from those that we have sort of witnessed in Europe. I was in New Delhi back in November when Trump got re-elected, and the mood in government circles was glib and it was gleeful, and it was in stark contrast to the mood in which we drank rounds and rounds of gin and tonic with British diplomats and Indian dissident journalists and academics. So the problem here is that, as this poll reveals, 84% of Indians believed when polled back in November that Trump would be good for India. 84 is a striking figure. I quote this piece, in fact, and I should tell this to Tim in my first ever piece for The Economist on India-US ties. This number comes up. So many thanks to Tim and the team for what we call a dinner party anecdote, which is once you've read a piece, there's something in it that is so striking that you will tell it at the dinner party you're going to that evening. And this is not only an astonishing figure in terms of the uniformity, it's just quite difficult in any democratic country to get 84% support for anything. Is also that it is the highest of the 24 countries polled, right? So India is not only quite bullish on a Trump presidency, it is exceptionally bullish in global comparison. Now, modern partnerships require mutual respect, and they certainly require mutual respect when it comes to a post-colonial country like India that will want its rising power status recognized. So poll Indians after Trump's latest missives on Indian tariffs and migrants and see again how those polls might shift, right? It seems to me that to a population enamored enough with strongman Modi to elect him for a historical third term last summer, there is some moment of recognition. If you think that Modi's assault on democratic institutions, disdain for religious minorities, and his demonizing of liberal elites is appealing, you will also appreciate those traits because you will recognize them in a figure like Trump. Now, other people's nativism appeals at a distance. It appeals in the abstract until that nativism comes for you. for your trade policies, for your sovereignty, and for your migrating compatriots. So this is very much TBD as Trump 2.0 continues its really gruesome trip towards ever more increasing levels of cacophony. So I'll just end on this note. There's often been quite a hierarchical tone to the way that the sort of Western tilt towards India and trying to court India is discussed in Western circles, especially in America. So some skeptical American analysts have been asking for years whether it makes sense to try and ally with an often prickly India. In speculative DC speak, they wonder if America's India bet will pay off. But I'd sort of suggest to you that we're now in the world of gambling and wild bets, all of us together. We have our own India bets in Europe, but India will also be evaluating its odds and risk tolerance from DC to Brussels.
Right. Thank you so much, Kira. The polyamory trope is very powerful. Let's see if Europe can come up with ethical version thereof. But one thing to reflect maybe further is the trade relationship, because that's where the action is very often. Maybe get into the weeds a little bit about what is preventing trade liberalization, because it's a nice segue. Brazil, one of the achievements of the EU of late is the Mercosur free trade agreement. That's been in the works for a long time, but now signed. But France is not convinced. But the big point, I guess, is that geoeconomic power is what the EU has, unlike defense and security and so on and so forth. But now I'll pass the floor to Rodrigo Moraes. He's now at the University of Southampton, but he got his DPhil here at Oxford, working with a good friend of our program, Andrew Currow. So Rodrigo, over to you. What is the Brazilian perspective on those matters that have been triggered on, and in particular the relationship with Europe, and of course, big elephant in the room, somebody in the White House. Feel free to reflect.
Thanks for the invite. It's great to be here sharing the panel with you. Thanks for coming. I'm going to address two questions. First, the effects of Trump 2.0 on Brazilian foreign policy and on Brazil-Europe relations. And second, the effects of changes in domestic politics in Brazil on Brazilian foreign policy and Brazil-Europe relations. And these two issues, of course, are interrelated. About Brazil itself, the main point is that the country can go to completely different directions over the coming year. There will be elections next year, and this can radically change foreign policy depending on who wins. So there are two main projects at this moment viable that could win the elections next year. The Social Democratic Project, the most important representative is Lula, President Lula himself. Projects more to the left are not really viable at this moment. And the other project is what I consider a neo-fascist project. The most important representative of that is former President Bolsonaro. He probably won't be able to run for the elections next year for legal issues, but others can run, defenders of Bolsonaro. Perhaps his wife, one of his 3 children, or more likely the current governor of the state of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas. This can have radical impacts on foreign policy because they are all strong Trump supporters. But at this moment, right now, the center-left government, the dominant approach in foreign policy is what Brazilian diplomats call Amorinism, after Celso Amorim. So Celso Amorim is the main foreign policy advisor to President Lula, and he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for about 10 years in total. His emphasis is on South-South relations as a way of promoting a multipolar order. So I call this approach a pole-building approach, pole-building foreign policy approach. So the idea behind it is to turn Brazil into a pole in a multipolar order. Of course, if this is viable, it's a completely different matter. But the diplomatic action of Brazil, from my point of view, is following this guideline. In over time, Celso Amorim, as a minister, he managed to shape the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But of course, there is a gap between rhetoric and practice. From my point of view, Brazil remains a leader without followers, to use a term used by André Malamud and Sean Burgess. And right now, my perception is that Brazil is going to try to fly below the Trumpian radar as much as possible, trying to avoid attention from Trump. So Brazil is not a major target, Trump. And the Brazilian government is going to work hard to keep Brazil in that position. That's my perception. Evidence of that. So 5 days ago, the White House published a document with a list of countries that impose higher tariffs on the US than the US imposes on them for the same product. So Brazil is at the top of the list because of ethanol. The reaction of the Brazilian government was very timid, very limited. There is, of course, a tension between this long-term building approach and these short-term concerns with Trump's government. So there'll be a tension between that. Because on the one hand, the Brazilian government needs exposition, needs to publicize its causes to become potentially a pole, but at the same time, it doesn't want to draw too much attention from Trump. And I think this year, COP30, so COP30 is going to be in Brazil, this year, I think we might see this tension, how the government plays with this, let's say, duality, these two aspects. On Brazil-Europe relations, now, I think Europe, in a sense, has an advantage over the US and also over China. Why? Because economic relations with Europe are not as divisive in domestic politics in Brazil as are relations with the US and also, to some extent, relations with China. Evidence of that. The previous government, the far-right government, and the current center-left government both prioritized the European Union-Mercosur free trade agreement, both governments. If we think about the counterfactual, a free trade agreement with the US, the political right will probably support this agreement, but the political left will probably oppose it because of its long-standing opposition to US hegemony in the Americas. So the Europe, the relation between Brazil and Europe has this perceived non-hegemonic nature, different from relations with the US, and to some extent also with the relations, with China. The relations with China are divisive in Brazil, even within the left. So there is on one side the South, what I call the South enthusiasts, trying to promote relations with China, but on the other side, people, the heirs of developmentalist theory, concerned about the patterns of economic relations between Brazil and China. Right now, so the Mercosur-EU Association Agreement has reached a political agreement in December 2024, but it has to go, of course, through the Council of Europe. What happens, it needs approval from 15 member states, representing at least 65% of the population. France and Poland oppose the agreement. So combined, they have around 22.5% of the population. So if they can persuade Italy to oppose the agreement, so there will be no agreement. So Italy will be key. Italy is the country to be persuaded. And the Italian government He's not taking so far any clear position on that. So these are just some data, the expected impact of the EU-Mercosur agreement. A few colleagues at the Institute for Applied Economic Research prepared this. I worked there for a few years. So there are expected positive impacts for the Brazilian GDP, also for Brazilian exports. There will be, of course, redistributive issues, the agribusiness sector and sectors with low technological intensity will benefit from the agreement, and the more high-tech sectors in Brazil will probably so. But again, this is not a divisive issue in domestic politics in Brazil. So, so this is part of our work that I'm doing with Felipe Krause, the Latin American Center here at Oxford. So we're doing a tweet analysis. So we got all Lula's tweets since the beginning of his administration in 2023, and we just identified which countries does he speak about the topics as well. So these are the top 10 countries, the most mentioned countries in his tweets, and he tweets a lot about foreign policy. So about 25% of his tweets are on foreign policy. Just as reference, so for Modi, for example, around 5% of the tweets are on foreign policy. And André Manuel Lopes Obrador in Mexico, also around 5%. So foreign policy is a big thing for you. So Argentina at the top, we have 3 EU countries, Portugal and Spain, the most mentioned, and third, Germany. And blue for positive references, gray for neutral references, and red for negative references. And consider quite a lot of criticism against Israel. So Portugal and Spain were critical. When they joined the European Economic Community in 1986, they were critical to bring Latin America closer to the EU. And from a point of view, they remain playing this role. Spain, for example, has the highest FDI stock in Brazil among European countries. So this is just Europe. So Portugal, Spain, Germany, and then Italy, France, and the UK. The negative reference in the UK is about Julian Assange. Julian Assange was here, so he's criticizing the UK government because of that. That's the only negative. So by topics, first economic and technological issues, but then second, environmental issues. So these are just tweets about foreign policy, right? Not tweets on domestic issues. Poverty and social inclusion. Third, peace and security, democracy, and human rights. Fifth. And then what I did was to compare tweets by country and by potential partner. In Europe, the US, China, and 4 European countries. So black is for economic issues, orange, poverty and social inclusion, green for environmental issues, and blue, democracy and human rights. Now, I want to draw your attention to the US, the black part of it. So, so these tweets are only for the Biden presidency. But you see that the emphasis in relations with the US were more on other issues than on economic issues. And from my point of view, this already reflected the challenges, the difficulties in the economic relations with the US. So you see that it's quite different for Europe, largely because of the EU Mercosur Association Agreement. China also has quite a lot of emphasis on economic issues. And there will be, in the case of the US, in any case, there will be a vacuum here, right? The question, right, is who's gonna fill this gap? Right? So for Lula, a few issues, for example, labor rights, which is a big part of the agenda between the US and Brazil. And labor rights, also environmental issues, also democracy and human rights. For this, just to finish, so for this year, the environmental issues will be at the top of the agenda because of COP30. The BRICS summit will be in Brazil in May or June. My impression is that the BRICS summit is going to be relatively minimalistic. So there will be a greater focus on COP30. And next year, there will be elections. The hardliners of the previous government planned to assassinate, right? Lula, when he was elected, after he was elected, the vice president-elect, and a key member of the Supreme Court. They aborted the operation just a few minutes before, hardliners of the previous government. And some of these people will, not exactly the same people, they will run for the elections next year. And I think democracy is going to be a big topic. So this is perhaps an area in which European countries could provide some help. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good that Europe still counts as a democratic model. Here, we're much more skeptical about this having confronted the urban phenomenon, but not just. And it's good that you also highlighted BRICS because there's this whole issue about alternative forums. Both the EU is keen on G20, which is relevant to all those big countries there. But BRICS remains an alternative, and there's, of course, skepticism how much it can achieve. But symbolically, it's out there. Now we move to Turkey. We have Galip Dalay, who is a fellow at Chatham House, but also a digital student here, and somebody we've worked together with for many years. So Galip is a contributor to the DAHRENDORF project from Europe in the changing world. I should have said it before. And obviously, Turkey is a bit of a different case given its proximity and very intimate relationship with Europe. But one thing that might also bring in connects to what Kira, to a great extent, Rodrigo had to say is that Europe very often is represented not by Brussels institutions but by individual member states. There are a lot of bilateral relationships within the big chunk of EU or European relations with a particular country. But it's one of the themes. But over to you, Galip, where we are right now in this saga with Turkey. What's new? What's same old, same old? And feel free to ignore some of my questions as well.
No, well, thank you very much. Actually, on the way coming from London on train, I was thinking, discuss it, in a bit differently, but like speaking with you upstairs when you suggested the 3 questions that should guide, in a sense, our talk. I took your part, not my part. So basically,
I'm a blind hegemon.
Exactly. So basically, what is changing at the global order level or the global level from the Turkish perspective? I mean, this discussion for Turkey is not it's not started by Trump. It was actually a world that was already living, and that's why, like, what does Trump represent for different countries? Also, it also shows how invested different countries and continents are in the US. I mean, for many in Europe, it was a regime change, the Trump. For many in Turkey or elsewhere, it's just an administration change. Well, it's not a regime change on a great level. So, and for Turkey, the global order, it was already living in a changed global order. And this changed global order was best exemplified by what was happening in its neighborhood. We just look at the 2 wars or the conflict that were all ongoing in its neighborhood, Syria and Ukraine. This was two neighbors, one of a maritime neighbor, other than his territorial neighbor. There was already a 2 war that was ongoing that was actually telling us a lot about how the global order has already changed. And Turkey was, in a sense, trying to adjust to this global order. So, in a sense, from the Ankara's point of view, what was happening in its neighborhood, in conflict contexts like in Syria, in Ukraine, Black Sea, Middle East, that was a microcosm of the changes at the global level and global order. When you look at it, what did you see there? I mean, just look at Syria. What we saw was the following: A, the downsizing in the Western footprint. when it comes to conflict management, because the Syria has become in 2011, 12, 13, you would talk about what US would do, what France would do, whether the Brits will decide to strike the Assad or not. But from 2015, 16, you discussed what Iran will do, what Turkey will do, what Russia will do. So in a sense, it was already a world that in which the Western footprint was decreasing. And it was already a world in which the logic of the sphere of influence was there. So you carve Syria into different sphere of influences, the Russian one area, the Turkey one area, the Iran one areas, the US one area. So it's the idea of the sphere of influence that right now Trump basically advocate at the global level was already happening on the other side of the border for Turkey. He already implemented it within the context within the context of Syria. And in this world, the war or the territorial changes, conquest, was not. It was no longer a taboo. Every day, you have to discuss what was happening in the two wars in the last few days, in Syria, in Ukraine. So therefore, the idea of the war is back. The idea of the territorial adjustment are back. The territorial conquest was that, and the transactionalism that once again we're talking about from the transactionalism is actually has become a useful mean when it comes to conflict management. It's where you kind of find a way to work with the actors that you disagree with. I mean, think of Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Those are the three actors that completely have different idea of domestic political order in Syria, the Syria's geopolitical identity, but then they agree on a very transactional manner on a framework in which they address some of the challenges there, and they look at the transactionalism as a way of actually, in a sense, managing the conflict, managing a conflict context in which their interests were diverging, if not conflicting. So, in a sense, transactionalism is not a bad thing. Transactionalism is actually, to some extent, making possible progresses on thorny issues. And there, the idea of partnership is also changing. So the partnership is not something institutionalized. It's not something has come with a straight jacket. The partnership becomes quite flexible, issue based, and it becomes very goal oriented. And so therefore, it is also things that was already happening, and that gave birth to one of the operational assumptions of the contemporary Turkey's foreign policy or the vision of internationalism. The world is not post-Western, but the world is no longer as Western-centric. There are different centers of power in the world. So therefore, this is the decline of Western exceptionalism in our imagination of the world. Because for a few centuries, the West was not one center, power centers among the others. The West was the center, both geopolitically, normatively, when it comes to your economic modernization, when it comes to your imagination of your place in the world, when it comes to your, redesigning of your own society. It was the center. Now it is becoming one center among others. It's still the most important center, so it's not like on equal terms with Russia or China, but the idea that it's no longer exceptional. It is probably the most important centers of powers, but it's not the only centers of power. So you have the normalization of the idea of the West in public and political imagination. In a sense, the decline of the West as a reference point, because for a long time, the West served as a reference point for Turkey's geopolitical identity, the idea to be the West to be seen as European. I mean, from the Ottoman Empire would have very much like to emphasize that it was an European empire or the modern Republican project to be the part of the Western of the West. So in a sense, the West, the Europe, was a reference point for the domestic political organization, the Turkish geopolitical identity. You see this decline of the West as a reference point and the decline of the West as an exceptional centers among the other center of the power. And for Turkey, this is not like something, at least for the elites of the ruling elites, this is not something to lament about. This is not something to be nostalgic about. This is something to adjust to. This is something to accept, if not to embrace, actually, because the existing of the more centralized power, that means also you have more leverage with different centers of powers. If you don't get what you want from the US, then you negotiate with Russian. The Russian will allow you to have 2 military operations into Syria, and then like you go to negotiate with Americans with already 2 military operations that you already undertook. So you already have a footprint there. So in a sense, this existence of different centers of powers is actually something positive. So what Trump changed in this global order? So what does Trump represent? Well, I mean, one of them is everyone talks about right now transactionalism. For Turkey, that was already there, including with Europe. The relation with Europe was very transactional. You want the refugees to be managed, well, okay, and then you give up on the language of normative language, the language of democratization, or you reduce your demands. So in a sense, there was already a transactional world there. The sphere of influence, it was already existing in the neighborhood of Turkey's neighborhood. Right now, the Trump is applying it to the global level. And that's why when you discuss the Ukraine, for Trump, when you look at it, that's precisely about the question of the sphere of influence, not about, what is right, what is wrong, but it's more about the question of the sphere of influence. And this is a world that I think many countries in the non-Western world was already somewhat adjusting to it, if not like some of them was actually aspiring to it. With this, you have the decline of a normative language, the value-based language, and obviously the parallel process of the rise of the civilizationalist languages, the rise of the particularist languages, the culturalist languages, and that obviously makes it increasingly more difficult to talk about universal conceptions of the things or the universal values, because now you have a contending or the contrasting languages, narratives. Some of them civilizational based, some of them are more nationalist in nature, some of them are more culturalist, some of them informed by religious values. But nevertheless, there is a decline of the universal language of values, universal language of rights, liberties, and etc. And with this, I would say, I think, and this is probably the most important development with the Trump making it extremely difficult to talk about geopolitical West as a single unit, or the West as a single unit. Because after the 1945, the glue, at least in geopolitical terms, it was the US was the glue of the geopolitical West. Without the US, there was no geopolitical West. So the glue that bind the geopolitical West was the US. And I think, and that's why the Trump's election was a regime change for the West, but it was government change or the administration change for the many in the rest of the world. Because the Trump basically, if not killing it, but significantly weakening it, the idea of geopolitical West. Now, many European countries have to grapple with the fact that collectively Europe might be a great power or a superpower, but individually most of the European countries are middle powers. But when Europe was part of the geopolitical West, obviously that was another story. The geopolitical West that was headed by the US. Now, probably many European countries have to grapple with the fact that it needs to make more partnership, more close relationship with many other middle powers to save, different form of multilateralism, or to save some of the things about the global order that we can agree upon. So, in a sense, the decline of the geopolitical West, or the weakening of the geopolitical West, as a result of Trump's action, probably is the single most consequential of contemporary global politics, particularly when it comes to how the relation between the West and the non-West is changing. Against this background, what do I expect with Turkey and Europeans? So that's come to the last part. I mean, historically speaking, Turkey's relation with Europe was always defined by the global processes, not by the logic of bilateral pros and cons. It was the global processes, it was the big global questions that defined the nature and the future of Turkey's relation with the West. And I think we are passing through such a watershed moment that will once again redefine the Turkish relation with the West. I think these processes, on quite some level, it will bring Turkey and Europe a bit closer, but not EU, Europe, and not like in terms of domestic political orientation on geopolitical matters. So I do anticipate we will see a bit more, the things will get a bit closer on geopolitical fronts between Turkey and Europe. That doesn't mean alignment. That doesn't mean like the both sides will not disagree on many things. They will disagree on many things. They will look at many things differently. But I think on the grand scheme of things, or compared to the past 6-7 years, we will see the things getting a bit closer on geopolitical fronts. And it was indicated. I just saw the Munich Security Index. The perception of Turkey, the geopolitical perception of Turkey, the polling was by the G7 countries plus BRICS, excluding Russia, so no longer BRICS, it's BRICS. So the polling was conducted in 11 countries, and you see a significant improvement in the geopolitical perception of Turkey. The Turkey, South Korea, Poland, and UK was the countries that saw the most significant improvement in their geopolitical perception by the G7 plus the big countries. And in G7, obviously, 4 of them are European countries, including UK, France, Germany, and Italy. So I think one of them, on the grand scheme of the things, we will see on geopolitical matters, the things get a bit closer. But the 4 questions will be crucial in defining the future of this question. The number one is the US question. The US is right now the single most important actor that is challenging global, more than China, more than Russia. And I think probably the US will define also for the European actors. Also, this is much more consequential. Russia alone cannot destroy the global order. China alone cannot destroy the global order, but the US can destroy the global order if it decides so. Therefore, how they will approach the US question going forward is quite important. Secondly, the Russia question. Historically, the Russia question brought Turkey and the West closer. The last 2 centuries, or more than 2 centuries, it was the Russia that was most of the time that brought Turkey and the West closer. I mean, I have mentioned this before. The logic, the factors, or the quest in 1852-56 during the Crimea War, after which the Ottomans became the part of the Paris Agreement, the Constitutional Law, and then 1952 the NATO membership. The 3 main factors that actually informed these 2 processes were exactly the same. The Russian threat, it was the Russian threat, the Russian challenge, the Ottoman and then the modern Turkish quest for geopolitical identity, the desire to be seen part of the Europe or the West, and then the quest for status. If you are invited to the Paris Agreement, or if you are a member of NATO, that means you are part of the most important table in contemporary global politics. This was like the 3 factors that cut through 1853-56, like what happened afterward, and then 1952 NATO membership. I think how to address the Russia question in the coming period will be still crucial. Obviously, the Turkey today looks at Russia differently than it did like a century or 2 centuries ago, simply because compared to Soviet Union and Imperial Russia, it is a bit reduced Russia. Therefore, a reduced Russia means also a reduced threat perception emanating from Russia. But it's also becoming equally revisionist Russia. So reduced by a revisionist Russia, and that will ignite some kind of counterbalancing strategies towards Russia. The third question is China question, and alhamdulillah, neither Europe nor Turkey has much idea about this. So therefore, it's not at this stage, it's not going to be one of the driving, something that will drive the both sides apart, because I think the both sides still does not have very crystallized idea about how to deal with China. And there's like different approaches within the Europe, and I think that in Turkey also, the China question has not been as formulated. And then finally, the neighborhood questions. Whether the Turkey and Europe will become partner or competitor in the shared neighborhood from Mediterranean, Middle East, all the way to Black Sea. I mean, in the reports, the ECFR report, obviously, I saw there was much emphasis on the Europe seeking partnership with Turkey, partly in the Middle East. I would actually argue the other way around. I think that probably the Turkey and Europe is much more likely to see eye to eye in post-Soviet space, in Black Sea, in Balkans, in South Caucasus, and Central Asia than in the Middle East. Because in many levels, in Black Sea, Ukraine, post-Soviet space, the point of divergence between Turkey and the West is very little. And both of them will, because the Turkey's influence there comes at the expense of Russia. Whereas in the Middle East, the Turkey and Europe looks at the Israel differently, Israel question differently. I mean, obviously there is like interconnection between Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, and there are also quite many points of disagreement between Europe and Turkey when it comes to there's Cyprus, there's Eastern Mediterranean crisis. So there are quite many areas of disagreements between Turkey and Europe that will prevent probably a meaningful working together anytime soon. But on particularly Black Sea, I think that Black Sea right now probably will be one of the first testing ground where I see the possibility of Turkey and many European actors working together, because despite the nature of the close nature of the relation between Turkey and Russia, the Turkey will perceive much more threat coming from the Russian attempt to dominate the Black Sea, because the Russia apparently wants some form of the Cold War borders in Black Sea. And I think the Cold War borders will pose quite a lot of questions. And then the final points, for a long time, when it comes to defining the future or the nature of Turkish-European relationship, there was always expectation the Europe coming with new initiatives to define this relationship. I think in the coming period, probably it will be Turkey that will come to Europe proactively asking to redefine the relationship, probably away from the membership, but this time with much more content.
Well, thank you very much, Galip. Since you mentioned the Treaty of Paris, 1856, one thought is that actually Turkey was present at the Congress of Berlin, and that's not
Yes.
But it's 1888, not the one on the Balkans. So the scramble for Africa included Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
When it acted as an imperialist power, that's something that
Yeah, European actors. It was like trying to be European.
it wanted to be right fast.
So, exactly.
Precisely. Mustafa Minawi,
Yes.
this historian, has done a great job looking at that period of the history.
Yes.
But I have two questions to everyone arising from your presentation. First of all, you said about middle powers trying to preserve what's valuable about global institutions, right? And because we have Trump with a wrecking ball, he's the revolutionary actor, if you will, trying to destroy everything or re-establish it. And then you have all those middle powers that one way or the other actually profited from multilateralism. So that's actually a question for all panelists. How does it work or doesn't? In the case of your countries, India, Brazil, do they have a vision or some ideas how they want to align with other players to uphold what's left? Or is it just investing too much expectations? They just muddle through, middle. They have partnership ad hoc, they have transactions, they want to get by, but they don't have a big vision how to sustain what we have already absent in the US. Second thought, you did refer to cultural exceptionalism, that there was civilizational discourse. So there was Western universalism that Europe initiated. And that all manners of back to say, no, we are different, we have our culture, we go back centuries. And that's, of course, suspect because very often it's a recent construct as historians and anthropologists know. But you do have those phenomena. You have Lutfa in India. You have the brand of religious nationalism that AKP exemplifies in Turkey. And I mean, Brazil might be different in that respect because probably, from what I hear, it's much more comfortable with a version of universalism. It's all left-wing ideas still play, but I'm curious to take your thoughts. So yeah, I mean, how this cultural identity factor plays into it? Is there a challenge? And should we care about it or just look at old geopolitics and just ignore this rhetorical epiphenomenon? But I think the first question is pretty relevant. So what do you care about? Can India save the world? Not enough institutions.
I don't see why you would ask a non-Western country to come and save an international order that was created in its absence without its interests considered. Right? So India wants a multipolar world with predictable rules. And so, yes, there are certain things about the current order that it'd be very keen to uphold. I would very much encourage everyone, and this kept happening at the Foreign Office, to encourage them to talk about cooperation and no co-optation. You do not go to a rising country like India with a proud tradition of non-alignment and a proud thousands-year-long civilization and say, can you please buy into our conception of world order? India has a really long tradition of thinking really deeply about world order that doesn't require co-optation. And you do not, for example, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, try and enlist India to uphold your order in which you do not want India to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, in which you do not recognize India's standing in the world. It's a very old school European way of thinking about how to talk with countries like India, which often gets rebuilt when people say talk to or at India as opposed to with. So there's this, and it sort of gets me to the question which I've been thinking about more broadly and also as part of this panel, which is it really the case that Europe has just ceased being the global reference point? Or is it that we are only really realizing that it never fully was that for a lot of the rest of the world? Of course, there is a sort of a lingering colonial standard of civilization to which a lot of places like India might feel beholden, at least sort of in the sort of old guard Congress circles. But how much of the world has always actually looked to peers like India or China, fellow non-aligned countries? They don't want to mimic American forms of development. Certainly, a lot of Indian conceptions of world order have always been in direct opposition to those ways of thinking about the world, direct opposition to the idea that the way you narrated global order is through a sort of bipolar Cold War fight. Why are we talking about the Cold War? Why are we not talking about the long shadow of decolonization, for example? And if you start narrating the world from that perspective, India becomes a central player right from before 1947. So partly this is a question of historiography. Is this really the case that that Europe has only just stopped being this reference point? Is it that Europe has only now, or the West has only now abandoned the language of values? What language of values was being pursued in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, if you're looking at the world from outside? So sort of some humility in how we think about our past. To a lot of more critical voices from outside Europe, Trump is simply Western hegemony with its gloves off, without a degree from Harvard Law School, right? But it ends up looking very similar in its actions, right? Deportations are now at a lower point than they were under Biden, right? So sort of thinking about some of the ceremonial pomp that gets put on some of sort of Western actions and how they might have always looked quite rough from the perspective of the rest of the world. I'm not suggesting that these are my personal opinions, but just to sort of give a little bit of a sense of what I imagine would happen if you had more representatives from Delhi talking. Civilizational discourse, I think, is interesting because what, of course, used to happen is you had civilization set against its barbarian enemies, right? And so the way that you would become seen as part of international society is you would move from sort of barbarian to what was actually a European international society. We mentioned Turkey's attempts at becoming seen as European by engaging in the imperial game. That's exactly what Japan did. Japan said, oh, well, this is what it looks like clearly to act like a European power. I'll just become more imperial. So civilization itself carries all kinds of interesting imperial undertones. But you used to have this sort of civilization versus, the enemies at the gates. And now, of course, we have civilizational discourse pluralized, right? So European civilization, Indian, or in the current rendition of the government, Hindu civilization. Vishvaguru, right, teacher to the world, the conception that India has something to teach, a very sort of pedagogical approach to how to think about world order. Paul will be a better place to speak about possible ways in which to sort of recover a more enlightened way of talking about civilization. But it seems to me that a lot of the way that civilizational discourse is now employed in India tends to take up some of the more ethnocentric nationalist tenets. And in that, it actually ends up looking very similar to European civilizational discourse, which of course is quite ironic given that it sets itself up in direct opposition to Europe. In many ways, Hindu nationalist thinking, insofar as it also borrows from several European traditions, ends up being much more European than some of the stuff that we had before.
Thank you for the two questions. So first of all, multilateralism. At this moment in Brazilian foreign policy, it remains, I would say, largely as a rhetorical device. So in his discourse, Lula and Southampton and others target three institutions, right? The IMF, the World Bank, and the UN Security Council. And these institutions should change. At the same time, this is not as relevant as it was in the 2010s when Lula was president. So evidence of that. So I was working at the government in early 2023 when discussions on the G20 were starting. So the G20, so Brazil hosted the G20 last year. And there will be three topics. So environmental issues, fight against hunger and poverty, and reforming global government. And over the discussions, this third topic was pretty much dropped. And eventually two remained, same, fight against hunger and poverty and environmental issues. I would say that it remains in these two areas, yeah. So the Brazilian government created something called the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty as a legacy of the G20, trying to do something about it. It's going to host COP30 this year. At the same time, it's a lot of rhetoric, right? And there's a big gap without rhetoric and practice. For two reasons. There is a lack of resources, but also the government is ambitious rhetorically, but at the same time it's quite risk averse, right? In terms of making huge commitments. Right? So I think it remains, but a lot more as a rhetorical device in the foreign policy district. So on the civilization perspective, I don't see cultural references as quite central in the discourse of Lula or others, with one exception, perhaps, it's on Africa, right? It talks a lot about Africa and emphasizing that the world should value African culture, and also emphasizing the importance of Africa for Brazil itself. So this is, I might be wrong. I'll check the tweets again, but let's see. So this is probably the cultural reference that is more relevant in this foreign policy discourse.
I mean, US and China can afford probably to have a low risk war. But I think if you're a middle power and small powers, you cannot afford to have a low risk war. You need some kind of institution, you need some kind of predictability, you need some kind of rules and norms to operate. The trouble that I see, so therefore, from this perspective, I think many European countries and then many countries in non-Western or non-European part can make a common cause. But the question is, in recent times, the perception of Europe as being committed to international has been severely weakened as well. I mean, now we can also take the comfort in Trump being an ugly face of the West. Otherwise, we are all lovely people committed to the rule of law, international law. No, I mean last week the U.S. administration has have uttered a horrible statement at Munich Security Conference. But at the same time, the same week, the Scholz had a podcast, and in the podcast he was asked, "What if the International Court of Justice decides that what Israel is doing a genocide?" He said that I don't believe. The question is very simple: if the International Court of Justice decides that what is happening in Gaza is genocide, and probably with now this ethnic cleansing, etc., it will be increasingly difficult not to say that's what's happening in Gaza is genocide. The question is very simple: how will the European countries look at this? And then the Merz got the question: if he's the chancellor, how will he approach the ICC's warrant for Netanyahu? So the criminal court, etc. Whether the Netanyahu would be able to come to Germany if he's the chancellor, he said yes. So the question is, I mean, if
But it's Germany, not Europe. There's Germany.
Europe without Germany, interesting. So
No, but I mean, there is a history.
No, but there is.
So it might be different in Paris.
No, exactly. But the thing is that everyone can have history.
Yeah.
So therefore, you cannot end these things. Like the moment when the issue of the international laws, those rules become the things of your particular history, then where are we going to stop? So therefore, the question is, the normative revisionism did not start with Trump, and particularly in the last 1 or 2 years, the Europe and the West has engaged in a significant level of normative revisionism. I mean, what Putin did, the geopolitical revisionism, the imperial war of conquest is a problem. But also the normative revisionism that we have seen that in the West was very palpable everywhere that you went to. Like if you go to China, this is, I mean, I went to China twice in the last 1.5 years. These are the things that they want to talk about. Like the things that probably will not get much attention in the Western media, but if you're in the Gulf, which I happen to go to Middle East Gulf, this is what you get, much more than the discussion on Ukraine. So in a sense, I think when it comes to those things, everyone, the middle powers will have a very much interest to have some form of multilateralism, to have some form of a function international law so that they can function. As I said, the US and China can't afford to live in a lawless world. They're superpowers, they have huge economy, huge military, huge, etc. But for middle powers, you cannot afford it. So therefore, there will be need for once again to maintain some form of multilateralism. But this maintaining multilateralism should not take the form of maintaining the privilege, because for many in the Europe, maintaining multilateralism can take the form of maintaining the privileges that's many of these countries that enjoy from this multilateralism. It has to be a real partnership, I think, as Kira said, not rather than maintenance or the defense of what existed before. There, I mean, on your question, I don't think that Turkey has a very refined idea of what kind of an international order that it wants. I don't think that it has a very crystallized idea. But the Turkey is asking for bigger share of the pie, not the changing of the pie or the destruction of the pie, because in the end, it is one of the beneficiaries of the existing international system. I mean, you hear quite a lot of languages that will resonate as if Turkey is a post-colonial country, but it's a post-imperial state. It's part of NATO, part of OECD, etc., etc. So therefore, Turkey itself is one of the beneficiaries of the existing international system. It wants a bigger share in the pie, and probably the international organization to be reformed in a way there is more regional representation in the UN Security Council or those kind of venues. That also means me having a seat there as well. But the question obviously would be how can you make efficiency, legitimacy, representation, all these things to reconcile with each other when it comes to redesigning of the international institution.
Yeah. Just one comment before I open to questions. I'm sure there are many. That multilateralism, when we discuss this lofty term, we always think about the high end questions of war and peace, genocide, responsibility, and so on and so forth. But I mean, in actual fact, you're dealing with lots of boring rules about how bubble exchanges work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, for example, in your plans, the contrast. So
Tariffs.
exactly, tariffs, all the nitty gritty about global life, really. And maybe it's worth also thinking about this kind of more middle ground, more inside of multilateralism, because it's what delivers the public goods. And very often columnists and our work bring that ability to think about issues that are, even in the best days, were never truly multilateral to start with. But let's park this thought here and open to your questions. I really encourage people who ask questions relate to all the three cases and not zoom in on a particular country, but often.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, one question I was thinking about while you were speaking, trying also to understand what a middle power really means in the wider context of the traditional core periphery discussion, but also the global north versus the global south. And what I would be interested to ask you is that from those middle power perspective, what is the meaning of the global south? Can they retain an autonomy in a world where they might have to take positions in the global north where everything basically is happening? What are they creating their own peripheries like mini cores in a completely new environment?
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. I guess it's a question for Galip. I was struck by your point, and I agree with it. The pivotal importance of Syria and Ukraine, of declining Western footprint. I'm not sure quite about the end of exceptionalism, but certainly moving in that direction. So it's really a question about the effects of Trump's victory. I mean, you have the kind of crude slide in the beginning, kind of thumbs up, thumbs down in terms of what people in the country think about that. But presumably, this is also, they see Trump's victory as a story of opportunism, or at least a possibility of something very new. What exactly does it mean by that? I mean, the people that you've spoken to, and we talk about the role, let's say, the UN Security Council or regional multilateralism, but is there any slightly more fleshed out conversation in Brazil or India or in Turkey in terms of what the Trump victory means in terms of an assertion in a world in which it looks like, at least, that the U.S. is withdrawing its presence or footprints in the area? I mean, is there already a kind of concrete discussion about what this represents in terms of both foreign and domestic policy for these three little powers?
David.
Thank you very much. What do people in the three countries you've been covering, in particular Turkey, think about the future of NATO?
Okay, let's take those three questions and we have another round later on. Then start with Galip and work in reverse order.
Well, I mean, the global south, I know that this is a term that I had very difficulty with. I mean, I don't think that I like it as well, because the question is China part of the global south or not? For me, this is not a very straightforward, it's not, I don't have a straightforward answer to this. And when I mentioned the middle powers, I know that there isn't an universally agreed upon definition of middle powers. But I don't mean only non-Western ones, and that's why, like, I think the alliance or the partnership of the middle powers has to cover both West and non-Western ones at the same time to be meaningful and impactful at the time. Particularly, that Trump is the one that is posing more threat to the global order than Russia and China. If it was only Russia and China, probably we would be talking about non-Western middle powers mainly. But the fact right now, the biggest threat probably coming from Trump, we have to talk about both the Western and non-Western. And not, when I say Western, I don't mean only geographically. Like, I put South Korea into this basket, I put Australia into this basket, but also South Africa, India, Turkey. Well, I mean, India, I don't know what it's, middle powers, great powers, superpowers. Again, like, all these categories are very, very selective. But so I don't have like this, like, neatly divided categories. This in my thinking. It's more important to talk about the the discontent, the nature of the discontent, rather than talk about the country based, like what is the nature of the discontent, rather than what is the individual country's discontent. I think that probably might come with more concrete talks. And there, like for instance, the question of Western and anti-Westernism, because as a category we have been discussing the anti-Westernism significantly, as also we previously argued, the anti-Westernism, the narrative and politics of it can mean dramatically different things. Just take Russia and Turkey. The narrative of anti-Westernism for quite some time were very similar to each other, like when Putin spoke, when Erdogan spoke. But when it comes to politics of it, Russia saw the expansion of NATO and EU as direct nation security threat that needs to be prevented. And we saw in the context of Ukraine, even by invasion, by annexation, by full-scale invasion, whereas like the Turkey is supportive of both the NATO expansion and EU's expansion, including to Ukraine and Georgia. So therefore, I'm not very clear what those things means. On your question, I think the question is more what does it mean for them, individually, or do you think what do they think? How did they see this process means for the global? Which one?
Well, it's much more of a national agenda in terms of it's much more of a national agenda in terms of the opportunism
I think
represented by this shift of power.
I think, like, personally, let me speak about Turkey. Even though I haven't heard this in this manner from anyone, but I think there was a divide between what probably Erdogan preferred and what many of the elites, foreign and security policy elite preferred. Probably Erdogan, more at personal level, preferred Trump, because there was some form of rapport with him and Trump that was not there with him and Biden. The fact that at personal level, it didn't seem that they were getting along well. With Trump, probably there would be much more kind of this family relationship. But my perception, actually, this was not. I don't think that the economic, foreign and security policy elite preferred Donald Trump, because at the institutional level things were working quite well. So yes, I mean there was the leadership level, not very good working relationship between the two sides, but the institutional level things seems to be like working well, and there was some kind of predictability. So I mean, the Turkey hosted, let's say, like the Russian and then the US chief of intelligence in Ankara. It facilitated quite many exchanges, so etc. etc. So in a sense, I don't think that there was the perception of Trump. So it differed from place to place. In the Gulf, I think there was different countries approached this question differently. The Saudi Arabia and UAE, I think, wanted Trump to come for obvious reason, and right now we see the fact that the meeting is taking place in Saudi Arabia in itself is also one factor. I don't think that under the Biden would have seen, or the Kamala coming would have seen as the first thing, a meeting would have happened in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and UAE clearly wanted the Trump returns. There's like quite many personal relationships with Jared, with family, etc. And the fact that probably being compromised is not a bad thing. When your close circle can be easily compromised, can be an advantage in this kind of circles. Whereas probably the Qataris wanted the Democrats, because also the blockade of Qatar, the Trump initially came in a sense as a supporter of it, then the Pentagon and others in a sense changed this. So in a sense, there's different countries looking at it differently. But the ambivalence of the regions towards Biden was much more informed by the Gaza. The fact that they saw that Biden was heartless, like to put it crudely, was like, was not sensitive at all to what was happening in Gaza. So in a sense, that made many people that would not normally be very in favor of Trump, made them ambivalent between Trump and Kamala, and the fact that actually Trump might enforce some form of a deal more than the Biden was. Now with the Gaza front, obviously, like the people probably would be more anti-Trump soon. But that was the perception that Trump can actually untwist that. The NATO questions, I mean, if the US decides to undermine NATO, that will be the end of NATO. I mean, this is the single most important factor in NATO. So you cannot have NATO without the US. And NATO is very crucial for Turkey. But all the discontent, the Turkey is very much security, foreign policy culture is very much shaped by NATO. And NATO is significant advantage that it has, even when it comes to countries like Russia. Turkey being a NATO member has extra leverage when it deals with Russia, when it positions itself in the world. And it is the most important institutional linkages that Turkey has with the West. So in essence, the undermining of the NATO will be quite negative for Turkey. But we probably will see in the coming period, and the Ukraine will precipitate this, more engagement, particularly when it comes to Black Sea and Ukraine. There I see both needs to bridge the gap between the European, non-EU, and EU members of NATO. And this will probably be much more needed when it comes to Black Sea and Ukraine.
On this note, Zelensky was in Turkey today as the Russians and Americans negotiating Ukraine. So that's a footnote what we have to say. So, Rodrigo, your thoughts?
Thanks for the great questions. Personally, middle power is global south. I see middle power as a, I mean, if you ask people here what middle power is, probably will have as many definitions as people in this room. But I see middle power as a residual category. So they are not great powers, not small countries, but they are countries with enough resources and willingness to influence the global agenda in at least a few areas. So Brazil is a middle power, Turkey is a middle power, India, that's a middle power, big power. But it is the Philippines, for example, a middle power, right? It has an intermediate level of resources, but it wouldn't characterize the Philippines as a middle power. For the global south, I've been thinking about that for a long time. I see the global south in two ways. I think there is an objective definition, developing countries or high and low income countries, but also subjective one. So we can think about the global south as an imagined community of nations and people that historically suffered from violence or exploitation from the developed West. And I think that the Brazilian government, for instance, plays with these two aspects when they think it makes sense. Specifically on Trump victory, right? I think there's a big difference on the political right and the political left. I think they have different projects. They may have similarities, but we can think about them in the same way that Obama and Trump had a few similarities. But their views on the role of the country in the world are completely different. For the political left, so Trump's victory reinforces a movement of reducing dependence from the US, right? Moving more towards other partners. For the political right, the issue seems very different, right? But Trump doesn't want allies, right? He wants like vassals, right? So vassal states. Right? And I think at least a few governments in Latin America are willing to play that role, right? The vassal states of the US and the Trump. The far right, from my perspective, is willing to play that role. But at the same time, Brazil is under sort of dual hegemony, right? From West and from China. And it comes at the far right is unlikely to emulate Trump's discourses on Europe and China, for example, because there will be material losses. So even if the far right wins, I don't think that economically there will be massive changes in Pacific relations. Because of concerns about the impacts of that on domestic constituencies. So there will be a more rhetorical bandwagon with the US, I think the far right things, but in practice, I see more of a hedging approach. And about NATO, the left in Brazil certainly opposes NATO. So the John Schreiner's argument, NATO and Russia is super popular, right? It went viral on social media there. But it's pretty distant, right? I can't see a strong preference in
But geography matters.
Yeah, geography, exactly, right? Geography matters.
Or general. Middle powers. I'm actually thank you for using this term, sort of bringing us back to it, because when I retweeted yesterday, I said the EU's global partners like India, partly to avoid the shitstorm that often happens when you post about India and sort of suggest a reading of their status that they don't think is an accurate reflection of where they are in the world. I've restricted who can respond to my tweets now.
So you against free speech.
I will say I am at this point against getting regular death threats from India Twitter accounts or trying to get me fired from the roles that I hold. But what is interesting is middle power might actually be the perfect mathematical median of the two things that India actually does claim to be somewhat paradoxically at the same time. So if you put these two together and divided it by two, maybe you'd get to middle power. But what you actually have are a sort of a slightly paradoxical dual claim, which is that India is a superpower, and hence it needs a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and that India is a subaltern post-colonial developing country, and hence you can't mess with its developing country status at the WTO. And it will hold these two things at the same time. So a kind of subaltern superpower. Both a geopolitical giant that deserves a permanent seat and a sort of historical victim. Yeah, definitely not middle power. But if you put the two things together that India does talk about itself as, maybe you do get to middle power. Not a term that I would use on Twitter. What is the meaning of the global south? I'm going to try and keep this really, really short, because when I still thought I was staying in academia and I was writing my second book proposal, it was going to be on the meaning or lack thereof of the global south. So I won't rehearse that now, partly to not get cold feet about leaving academia. I think what's crucial here, though, is that what we've seen is a really significant shift away from what it meant for there to be a third world versus what it means for there to be a global south. And a lot of the times in Western circles, there's this understanding that the third world was some sort of condescending idea. But of course, people like Nehru really sort of came to embrace it because it was supposed to be the third estate, right? Holding the powerful to account. It was a normative conception of world order in which India had a really important role to play. It was sort of, I don't actually know the English word for this, but it was a Kampfbegriff, right? Like it was a, yeah, like a term of struggle and sort of campaigning and lobbying, right? Whereas the global south is something that you can now hear at Davos as a very technocratic term. So in a way, the global south is devoid of a lot of the radical potential that we had earlier. I won't go into what I was going to say on conceptual stretching, because actually that will go so deep into the IR theory weeds that I will have to come back to academia. But what I will say very briefly about India is trying to lead the global south as a way of escaping it, right? So it wants to imbue itself with a representational mandate from the rest of the global south so that it can bargain for a permanent seat for itself at the great power table.
It's the same as Elmon.
Right, but we saw this, but they do it in a very explicit way, right? So at the G20, which India hosted in September 23, it hosted 2 rounds of something before the summit called Voice of the Global South. And the idea was that this summit would happen before. These were all the excluded, marginalized countries that never made it to the G20. India would take on board what they said, represent that rest of the world at the G20 and hence have more power at the G20 because it is speaking on behalf of the wretched of the earth, right? So this is the term that the Modi government is really keen on using. And so every once in a while you hear these terms about the third world and the global south being really condescending, westernized terms, very much not the case, something that India itself has been very, very keen to use. Very briefly on India and the US, India is quite opportunistic about the Trump presidency, partly because they think that they sort of figured out how to, they sort of gamed out how to talk to Trump, right? Modi and Trump get along. We had the Namaste Trump and Howdy Modi events, which were these mass rallies in Ahmedabad in Gujarat and in Austin, Texas, in the first Trump presidency. That basically just looked like joint campaigning between the two, right? Like campaign slogans from the Modi era were used to advocate for a second Trump presidency. So they were banking on a sort of bilateral bromance. And to India, Trump has many redeeming qualities that to a lot of Europeans wouldn't look like positive traits, right? A strong man's ambivalence about Putin that will probably be a lot less hard on India for pursuing its ties with Russia than the Biden administration was. A pragmatist disinterest in imparting liberal lessons on human rights and democratic backsliding that have long irritated India, and a businessman's solidarity with his own kind that might let Gautam Adani, who is a billionaire business tycoon and long close Modi ally, get off the hook for bribery and fraud charges in the US. So there's a lot of sort of personal promise in Trump, as weird as it might sound to a lot of us. Sort of on a broader level, of course, this sort of bipartisan article of fate, which is that these two countries need each other to hedge against China. I've spoken a little earlier about Western misconceptions of what it means to work with India to hedge against China, because just because you are also worried about China doesn't mean that you have the same understanding of how you want to play that relationship. India is a next door neighbor, and much as I always say, as a Finnish person, stationed permanently next to Russia, when you are next to the giant who is bullying you, you know, you have to be a little bit more careful in how you play it. But you know, trade wise, EU and India trade has more than doubled in the last decade to almost $200 billion last year. So there is a sort of a sort of structural imperative to that relationship. Now, of course, there's issues on trade, there's issues on migration, there's issues on defense that will all crop up. But the harder Trump self-radicalized, and I think this is the really crucial, if we return to questions of global order, the harder that Trump self-radicalized in his second term, the more obvious it becomes that there's actually a really profound disconnect in how India and the US want global order to evolve, despite sort of sugary expressions of autonomy that we were subjected to from last week's White House visit. Because, of course, India does not want a world of America first. It wants a multipolar order with America pushed off its perch as global superpower. And Trump and Modi might be able to have more joint comments about the deep state at press conferences, which some of us will have to watch through at 5 o'clock in the morning to be able to report on them. But I think there are really fundamental structural fault lines that will also come to the fore.
Great points, gentlemen. Back.
Yeah. So my question is to Kira. Yeah. So as you mentioned that EU and India relationships have been underwhelming to say the least. Now there is all this talk in the media that India is the next supergiant, but in reality, does EU actually believe that the reason for these relationships is just inefficiency and passiveness, or is there just a lack of intent? And I ask that because of two reasons. Like post-COVID, there was this great opportunity because back home in India, there was this optimism that now everybody's trying to diversify the supply chain and there's this China plus one opportunity, so India would capitalize on that. Now, it didn't happen. Partly one of the reasons was India itself, because just the business infrastructure and manufacturing setup isn't that great, but even EU didn't really invest that much in India. And the other reason is that you mentioned about adversaries, and I agree, Russia is off the table. US is an EU ally, so again, even EU wouldn't have that intent to do that. And China is complex. There's opportunity there, but it's complex. But if EU really wants to quote India, I mean, Pakistan is just such an easy thing to do. So, so do you think that would be on table if EU really wants to put just a little hard stance against Pakistan? And I'm pretty sure Modi would be just over the moon.
Oh, sorry.
I think Timothy wanted to.
Then I need to write this.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you a chance for some concluding remarks by asking what seems to be the question that comes out of this whole really interesting discussion. What is the desirable global order if the Western-centric, essentially American-led, is over or done for, we don't want it? All of you in your different ways have said something about more equal multipolar world, roughly speaking. But are there people in your countries who are addressing questions such as who or what decides who gets to be a pole and who isn't a small people? What happens to those poor countries which aren't going to be a pole? Are they fated to be parts of a sphere of influence, which all of you mentioned, which sounds rather like the old European civilization to me? What are the ground rules for relations between poles in this more equal multipolar world? Who or how do we adjudicate in disputes between the poles in this world? How do we confront genuine global challenges like global warming or regulating AI in this more equal multipolar world? Is anybody trying to begin to address these questions, or if not, will you please?
All right. Let's collect whatever outstanding questions we have. Evgenia.
It would be very much in line with like the question of addressing climate change. Thanks a lot for bringing this up. I was thinking about, have you been considering framing like the change of this global or whatsoever, like global order, global disorder via the energy security dimensions? Like, have you been thinking that it is the energy insecurity that brings a lot of this global disorder in the table?
I'm sorry, thank you so much. It was a great discussion, and I look forward to listening to the conclusions based on Timothy's remarks. And my question would be, one thing that I thought was missing here in all this talking about multipolar world is this idea of the Second World War. Is it a concept that somehow exists in the idea of your powers? So, like
Right.
India, Brazil, and
Well, thank you so much. And let's go back to our panelists, starting with Kira. And if you could also offer some concluding thoughts before we proceed to the next stage of our order discussion.
Probably not. To the question on is the EU serious about quoting India? There's this saying about never assuming malice when you can assume incompetence. And I think a lot of the times there is just very little, and Nicholas Quantum, people inside the EU will say this, they just don't know how India works and what comes out of that, especially after Brexit. Right? So a lot of the India expertise actually came from Britain, so that's no longer there. So a lot of the time, there's just not a very good understanding of how you might talk to India. So it comes across as crude. Again, the Charlemagne column on what Europe can learn from India, I thought was quite well done. It's very funny. The reason it had such a shock effect is because Indians are so surprised to see that Europe wouldn't come in imparting lessons. It might actually come to India wanting to learn such things, right? And that already tells you something about the deeply hierarchical way in which a lot of this process has taken place so far. Now, actually, in terms of like, does the EU think of India as an actual potential superpower? Does India think of the EU as any sort of superpower? I think what they might actually have in common is a sort of ontological anxiety about their own superpower status, and maybe that might bring them closer together in some weird therapeutical sense, right? Both of them kind of want to think that they are superpowers. They want to think that this is a historical narrative that has endowed them with special responsibilities and a sort of unique access into understanding how global
Sorry,
order operates.
but I think your poll suggested that quite a few Indians think that use on the way up. So the figure was that if you look at the EU of 10 years from now, they think that they'll have more power.
I mean, we are very happy to hear that. I think if you talk in government circles, partly it's also a bit of a the lady does protest too much situation, but there is this constant sense of you didn't come to us for all these years. We're quite miffed, and now you're coming to us. We don't need you anymore. So again, a bit of a sort of like status competition. But they share this sort of ambivalence about their own superpower status, a disappointment that others are not willing to see them as superpowers, and clearly some selves are soul searching on whether this is actually true, and hence you over project, right? The fine line between an inferiority and a superiority complex, which defines so much of international relations. I'd be very disappointed if going after Pakistan is what wins you India. India is 7 times bigger in terms of its economy. It sits at the global high table. Unlike Pakistan, it has had its nuclear status very much recognized by the global superpower. If that's all that it takes, then you are not a superpower. Then you really were just as insecure as your retractors have been saying. So the jury is out on that one. I'm just saying that the jury is also out on how we might think about how to talk about the EU. India is quite comfortable talking about this language of sphere of influence when it comes to Europe, right? So when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, all of a sudden, actually, the most sensible statesman-like thing to do is let Russia kind of handle its things. And to come back a little bit to the question of NATO, right? NATO went too far, and actually, if you respected some sort of old school 1815 balance of power understanding, maybe we wouldn't be in trouble. So Indians find their realist side when it comes to Europe. It is less excited about the rest of the world thinking about its own neighborhood as a sort of sphere of influence place, especially when it comes to China potentially pushing itself into India's backyard. All of a sudden, then we don't want a realist conception. Then we want to think in slightly different terms. So it is sort of opportunistically agnostic about how to think about global order. I don't have any fancy concluding thoughts yet.
So I think that's good enough.
Thank you.
That's the question that is behind this. Is if they become poles, will they be different types of great powers? Or you know? If we compare the behavior of the Russian government and of the Chinese government, from my point of view, they're completely different types of great power. Russia is more of a 19th century type of power, thinking about power in direct territorial control. China has a far more sophisticated view of how to observe. So, look, I think all these countries will not leave the global south, right? They will remain the global south, struggling with many of the same problems that they have struggled with for decades. It can be levels of violence, it can be corruption, it can be high levels of inequality. And from one point of view, so this somehow may shape their foreign policy priorities. At the same time, in talking about Brazil, I think Brazil is traditional in the sense that it seeks to promote 2 norms of the international society, right? The norm of sovereignty, but also the norm of hierarchy. I agree with you in the sense that Brazil is not in the same league of all the countries, right? Of Argentina, Mexico, etc. Right? It's in the top league. Evidence for that, right? So, alongside Germany, Japan, and India, Brazil forms the G4, right? Demanding a permanent seat at the Security Council for itself. Right? Also, the G20. So the Brazilian government has never criticized the fact that most countries are simply not represented. Again, right, certain middle powers or certain developing countries should have certain privileges, right, in this world. More evidence for that, the Brazilian government is traditionally, right, it's a lot of sovereignties, right, sovereignties. but it can also violate sovereignty occasionally, right? An example, right, in the tweets, we spoke about a lot about Argentina. But why is that? It's because Argentina is an important partner, of course, but because he was campaigning for Alberto Fernandez, right? Lost the election. So you say that he was promoting another candidate in a different country. Is this really of respecting sovereignty by trying to interfere in domestic politics? Like at the end of the day, that's what he was doing. The point on the ground rules for relations among poles and how do you confront the big questions? Yeah, there's a big tension in that. You see that clearly indicated China, right? So China emphasizes sovereignty, no interference in the domestic affairs. But again, how do you solve the global issue? I don't think they have an answer, a clear answer for that. Besides just rhetoric, right? Saying that yeah, we should invest in multilateralism, etc. But what exactly would this global space, this global governance space look like? Which type of architecture? I don't think any of these countries have a clear answer for this question. On energy issues, I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, like this is not my area of expertise. I apologize for that. We can talk more about it later. There was a second Cold War. I'm not sure, to be honest, right? I mean, if we're having or not. You're asking what I think, right? Not what I not perception, right?
That is a concept that runs around.
Yeah, I think what we have is a situation of negative peace, right? In the US and China. So theoretically, years ago, we could have a situation of positive peace, right? But what we have now is that they're not friends, right? They're not allies. They're not at war. And this is likely, of course, it's likely to remain. But then the question is, what's the difference, right, between negative peace and Cold War? Right? For Cold War, we are global. I tend to think about Cold War as a global process or structure, right? And active peace can be either global or local.
All right. So before I pass to Galip, let's play the devil's advocate. And since you mentioned spheres of influence, and I could be a bit more Eurocentric and say that compared to those three, actually Europe has been much more successful in co-opting its periphery countries on the other side because it has the tools and the know-how. I mean, Turkey wanted to build a regional order in the Middle East, not very successfully. Brazil to intervene in places, but it's Argentina, and Venezuela, like India in its region is not a success story by any measure. But over to you, Galip, if you can wrap up the.
Well, I mean,
discussion.
I'll already partially doing answer. I think the Timothy's question is probably the crucial question, and I think this is the dilemma of many of the discontent of the Western-centric international. I mean, it's much more easier to be clear in what you don't like than what you like, because then the moment that you pass from rejecting to proposing, you have many difficulties. I mean, just look at the BRICS. The BRICS today is a powerful narrative, but it's not a powerful vision of an international system. It gives an alternative, a very powerful platform to a manifesting of a powerful narrative about unhappiness, about unimprovements of the global system. But the moment that you go more than this, you have difficulty because the two members are already UN Security Council members. The other are aspirant, whereas during the Cold War, there wasn't, during the non-alignment movement, there wasn't the UN Security Council member that were also part of non-alignment. So the Putin or Modi or Xi Jinping is not like Nasser, Nehru, or Tito, because there was actually much more real things that also brought Nasser, Tito, and Nehru together in terms of the rejection of the international system. Whereas it's not as real what brings Modi, Xi Jinping, and Putin together. The question of sphere of, I think the three things, but I see is quite important. Sphere, seat, and status. Because most of these countries, obviously, how they approach the question of the sphere of influence, very much depend on whether they will get sphere or whether they will become part of the spheres. So if you ask from the Turkish point of view, Turkey thinks that it will have its spheres rather than it becoming someone else's sphere. So therefore, it will not reject the idea of the sphere of influence very much, because that also means that it will also have some sort of a sphere. With sphere, it hopes that it will get also a heightened seat at the international level. With a heightened seat, we get also a heightened status in international affairs. So, but if you are a smaller country, probably you will be very scared of this, because that means you are becoming part of the different spheres of the spheres of someone else. So therefore, this question is very much like depend on whether you get a sphere or whether you become someone else's sphere. And on the narrative of Second Cold War is also very much related to this. How present is the narrative of Second World War in the discussion of the non-Western states? Because the Second World War in the Western discussion is really crucial. The Second World War is like this turning point. The things that happened before it, the things that happened afterward. Afterward, we created a new international system, etc., etc. So therefore, the Second World War, or the Western narrative on the global order, is a watershed moment. It is not as watershed moment in many non-Western systems, because largely this was a European or Western base. Yes, I mean there was Japan, etc. But for instance, for the Middle East, I would say the First World War, the narrative of First World War was more crucial. There was, before the First World War, there was the Ottoman order. Afterwards, there was a complete new order. After the Second World War, there was still the continuation of the order that was created after the First World War, not a new regional order. The Second World War did not create a new regional order in the Middle East. It was basically, yes, I mean, instead of Britain, France, it became the US in a sense. The Suez moment probably on many levels is more important for the Middle East, because the Suez, in which it was the realization that the region will not be shaped by the old colonial masters of France and Britain. Now it will be the US and Soviet Union. So in a sense, the Suez moment, I would say, on many levels was more important. Yes, maybe that was the result of the exhaustion of these old colonial powers in the Second World War. But related to this, the Second Cold War, again, I think the Cold War memory right now on many levels, many in Turkey would reject this, because the idea of being a flank of NATO is not seen as very popular things. It's that you are basically you are adjusted to a system in which you are flanked, you're not part of the centers, etc. So it's kind of a stated diminishing things, being a flank of the NATO. And so the Second Cold War, I don't see being as much present in the popular discussion in the non-Western part as it is that you're here.
Well, I think that was a very rich and thought-provoking discussion. I think would give a run for their money at the Euro Security Forum. If there were journalists, Twitterati, would have generated many more tweets than Lula probably. This discussion, and let's say to be continued. And thank to our speakers for the excellent performance and the rich discussion. Stay tuned for more events from the DAHRENDORF program that will be shared.
By the way, do you also see that I lost a lot of hair because I cannot keep my eyes from it? At the top of my hair, it's like a lot of loss of hair.